So we have lecture number 2 today by Richard Giragosian. You already know him, one of the foremost analysts of Armenian politics that we have today. And Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Fortunately, we saved time, no need for introductions. But I do want to welcome you back. Today's presentation is going to be slightly different than the first one in terms of probably more interesting, to be quite honest, and a more concise overview of Armenia's new post-war strategy. The reason it's going to be concise is specifically because I want to focus more on your questions. In looking at Armenia's post-war strategy, I do want to present 4 thematic areas. First, in order to better understand post-war strategy, we need to look at the pre-war starting point in terms of Armenia from 2018 to 2020, the pre-war period of the Pashinyan government. The second thematic area is looking at the war of 2020 itself and how that introduced a rather painful new reality for Armenia. The third area of emphasis will be on Armenia's response to the war of 2020, and that will take us from 2021 into 2022. And the final area will look at the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, and that will take us into the present. But in terms of Armenia's post-war strategy, when the Pashinyan leadership came to power in a rare victory of nonviolent people power, what was interesting was an impressive degree of discipline in 2 ways. Discipline in terms of no violence, but also discipline in terms of the narrative, no geopolitics. There was a consistent, conscious effort of no flags in the demonstrations and a domestic agenda. They did not want Armenia to be seen incorrectly as a new Maidan. It wasn't about Russia versus the West. It was domestic driven. In that context, what was important in this period of 2018, coming to power, it was also a political context where nationalism no longer resonated in terms of the political discourse. And what we see is literally in Armenia, a confirmation of a political concept from the United States, from a guy called Tip O'Neill, former congressman, speaker from Massachusetts. His famous line was, "All politics is local," meaning that politics is trash collection, fixing potholes. It's all local. There was an Armenian emphasis on all politics is domestic. It's anti-corruption, it's democracy rather than geopolitical or nationalist posturing. What's interesting about Prime Minister Pashinyan coming to power, he was very different than previous leaders. Although from our perspective, Armenia is still an infant country. In other words, we've had 3 presidents and two prime ministers, technically. It's not exactly a long data set. But in terms of the uniqueness of Pashinyan, previous presidents, Kocharyan, Serge Sargsyan, came to power from Nagorno-Karabakh and also came to power because of Nagorno-Karabakh, the frozen conflict. Pashinyan had no such baggage, no connection, no tie to Nagorno-Karabakh. And in addition to no baggage, he was also emphasizing no conflict. He saw Nagorno-Karabakh, the frozen conflict with Azerbaijan, as an albatross, as a burden on Armenian development. In his view, the tail was wagging the dog. Beyond no baggage and no conflict, for Pashinyan's worldview in the beginning, there was also no Karabakh. In other words, he was not driven by a prioritization of resolving Nagorno-Karabakh or even defending Nagorno-Karabakh. What was most interesting, however, during the early period of the Pashinyan government, there was a surprising degree of personal chemistry between the Azerbaijani president, Ilham Aliyev, and the Armenian prime minister. It also led to new and higher expectations from Azerbaijan that Armenia is more democratic, is much less nationalist, and much more of an interlocutor over Nagorno-Karabakh. Those new expectations, however, were dashed in this period of 2018-19 especially, where statements by Prime Minister Pashinyan, most notably Nagorno-Karabakh is Armenia, were tending to contribute to a perception and sense of betrayal in Azerbaijan. President Aliyev of Azerbaijan felt betrayed, angry, and let down from his higher expectations from the Armenian side. This, in part, contributed to the move to war by Azerbaijan in 2020. And that comes to the second part of the pre-war period that drove Armenian strategy. And that was the October 2020 launch of a unprecedentedly long military offensive by Azerbaijan, the War of 2020 that lasted 44 days. The War of 2020 was militarily unique, precisely because there were a number of new factors militarily that drove Azerbaijan's success. Azerbaijan enjoyed unprecedented Turkish military support that included not just UAVs, drone warfare, but included the presence of the Turkish Air Force in Azerbaijan, fighting alongside and in support of Azerbaijan. What we also see is it was militarily unique because it was the first time that the Azerbaijani military had a logical, limited campaign objective. It was not about Armenia. It was not about Nagorno-Karabakh. It was a military campaign to regain areas and districts of Azerbaijan beyond the borders of Nagorno-Karabakh that were initially seized as buffer zones for the Armenian side. And the terrain, the topography, was much more favorable to an attacker. It was flat land rather than mountainous like Nagorno-Karabakh or Armenia. And part of the reason that it kept going for 44 days is the unexpectedly weak defensive response by the Armenian side. And the Azerbaijanis initially expected between 5 and 10 days of a campaign. They just kept going because they kept winning. What was also interesting was Russian complicity. Russia was complicit in looking the other way, in allowing this to proceed, in part because they were expecting a limited 5 or 7 day campaign and a limited campaign not attacking Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh. What we also see are two very significant aspects of the War of 2020. First was the casualties. The most significant casualty from the War of 2020 was not a loss of territory, nor was it death, casualties. The real casualty here was the demise of Armenian arrogance and complacency. Armenia at that time thought they were the Israel of this region, when in reality we were the Palestinians, in terms of, unfortunately, this ill-placed arrogance. The second casualty was most important as well. It was the end or death of deterrence. And we still lack deterrence, where nothing and no country is stopping Azerbaijan's threat of military force. There's also a second aspect of the war that's most important, and that is the emergence of two dangerous precedents. The war of 2020, don't forget, predated Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. But these two precedents only encouraged Putin's move to invade Ukraine. The first dangerous precedent was Azerbaijan's victory in 2020 represented the validation of the use of force over diplomacy. That's a threat to Western values and to stability in the region. The second dangerous precedent was not only a validation of the use of force, but a victory of authoritarian power over struggling democracy. This was also a threat to Western and European values. However, despite these dangerous precedents, there were two surprises in Armenia. One, the government of Armenia was still re-elected in early parliamentary elections, despite losing a war. The second surprise was, despite the dangerous precedents, there was no crisis in confidence in Armenia. There was no loss of faith in democracy, despite Azerbaijan's victory. There was no appeal or attraction for strongman authoritarian leadership, sacrificing democracy for so-called security. We weathered that storm. The third area of focus was Armenia's response to the war of 2020. The Armenian government recognized the need for compromise with Azerbaijan. It was almost cutting its losses and engaging Azerbaijan in a more genuine degree of diplomatic negotiations. In addition to recognizing compromise, it was also based on the recognition of many missed opportunities in the past, where Armenia in the past, with compromise, could have gained more in negotiations with Azerbaijan than what was the outcome of the war. The second interesting element of Armenia's response was a move to localize the Karabakh conflict. In the beginning, it was mediation by the United States, France, and later the European Union, as well as the Russian Federation. These were the sole diplomatic mediators, but there were no negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan without that mediation. Localizing the conflict meant Armenia and Azerbaijan turned to bilateral negotiations with no outside force or player. This was also significant in bringing the conflict home. Negotiations were no longer at the invitation of Washington, Brussels, or Moscow. An interesting also aspect of this was Armenia's challenge to better manage Azerbaijan's maximalist diplomatic position, where Azerbaijan, don't forget, had its first military victory ever. It's very hard to climb back down. Azerbaijan remains maximalist and rather drunk with victory. Demands both outrageous and acceptable have also defined this maximalist position. The challenge for Armenia, however, is to better differentiate between what's a real demand and what's simple posturing by the Azerbaijani leadership for domestic political purposes. In this context, the challenge is also that Azerbaijan needs conflict. needs to demonize the Armenians in order to distract its population domestically from the lack of democracy and from family corruption from the ruling Aliyev clan. In other words, the absence of legitimacy has tended to drive the need for conflict. And the fourth final element of Armenia's post-war strategy runs from December 2022 until September 2023. In December of 2022, Azerbaijan was adopting a strategy of the Game of Thrones, and they imposed a siege of Nagorno-Karabakh, literally a medieval siege, cutting off gas, interfering with electricity, and isolating and blockading Nagorno-Karabakh. That culminated in a move by the Azerbaijani military that forced the capitulation, the surrender of Nagorno-Karabakh within 24 hours. There were also political implications there in Armenia, because Nagorno-Karabakh was the last stronghold or bastion of support of the Armenian opposition. And we also see, against that backdrop, Armenia's post-war strategy now driven by new factors. The first, of course, is a policy of so-called diversification, trying to garner and gain as many security partners as possible, well beyond the limited framework of the West and Russia, and looking more to Asia, looking more to other areas of the world, including the more non-aligned or even BRICS style, neither West nor East elements. The second element of the post-war strategy is defense and security reform, trying to transform and not rebuild the Armenian armed forces, but rather to transform into a new home guard, territorial defense, a smaller force based increasingly not on conscription, but on contract-based voluntary and professional service. The third new element of Armenia's post-war strategy is an element that's been missing for a long time in Armenia. It's an end-state objective, where even when the government came to power in 2018, there was no articulation of what kind of Armenia they wanted to build. There was no end-state objective. However, in the post-war strategy, the end-state objective now rests on three specific elements. First is to understand that a country does not choose its neighbors and has to adapt and adjust to geography, hence normalization with Turkey, diplomatic negotiations with Azerbaijan. And for Armenia, it's also about dealing with Russia in terms of overcoming decades of overdependence on Russia. A second element of this new end-state objective is a focus on connectivity, the restoration of road and rail. From an Armenian perspective, the imperative for opening closed borders, establishing economic interdependence, is the necessity to regain deterrence that we've lost from the war of 2020. Economic interdependence changes the calculation and imposes a cost on Azerbaijan, a cost for Turkey, if renewed hostilities close the trade routes and transit routes that were reopened. In this way, Armenia is seeking to become more of a gateway and a platform, a transit state. And in this regard, the strategic priority for Armenia is to overcome isolation. Isolation also in terms of geopolitical insignificance. and connectivity is seen with economic interdependence as the most effective way to accomplish that. And one of the more controversial elements of this end state objective is the difficult decision that was rather embraced by the Armenian government, and that was Armenia is not seeking to rebuild its military. What's lost is lost. There is not an attempt of rebuilding the military for revenge or to retake what is lost. In this regard, it's both difficult and controversial, but the Armenian government is also following its own vision of differentiation between real Armenia, the borders we have today, the need of our national interest today, not from the past, but from the present.